He studied Julius Caesar for years. He modeled an American criminal empire on the Roman legions. He declared himself boss of bosses and believed the title would protect him the way it had protected emperors 2,000 years before. It protected him for exactly 5 months. New York City, September 1931. In an office on the 9th floor of the Grand Central Building, Salvatore Maranzano sat behind an enormous desk, surrounded by the trappings of a man who believed he had achieved something historic. He had just defeated his greatest rival, restructured the Italian-American underworld into a rigid hierarchy modeled explicitly on ancient Rome, and declared himself boss of bosses, a title that, in his mind, carried the same weight and permanence as Caesar's own claim to supreme authority. He believed he had built something that would last for generations. He had less than an hour to live. But the real story was never only about his death. It was about the elaborate, fascinating, ultimately tragic delusion that preceded it. The story of a man so convinced of his own historical destiny that he failed to recognize the much simpler, much more dangerous reality standing right in front of him. To understand Salvatore Maranzano, you need to understand what made him different from every other gangster of his generation. Most of the bosses who built American organized crime during Prohibition were pragmatists, men focused on profit, territory, and survival, who used violence as a tool rather than treating it as part of some grand historical project. Maranzano was different. He was, by multiple accounts, genuinely educated, having studied for the priesthood in his youth before turning to a life of crime in Sicily and then America. He read history. He understood Latin. He had, unusually for his world, intellectual pretensions that extended far beyond the practical business of bootlegging and racketeering. And somewhere in that education, he developed an obsession with ancient Rome that would define his entire approach to organized crime. What happened next changed the meaning of everything that came before. Maranzano arrived in New York in the late 1920s as part of the wave of Sicilian immigrants connected to the Castellammarese clan, named for the town of Castellamare del Golfo in Sicily. He quickly established himself as a rival power center to Joe, the boss Masseria, who had dominated New York's Italian criminal underworld for years. The conflict between them, rooted in old-world regional rivalries, personal ambition, and competing visions for how organized crime should be structured, erupted into what historians would call the Castellammarese War, a brutal conflict lasting roughly 2 years and claiming dozens of lives. Maranzano positioned himself throughout this conflict as the bringer of order against Masseria's chaos. He told his followers that Masseria represented the old, disorganized way of doing things, while he, Maranzano, understood the deeper historical principles that should govern any successful empire, criminal or otherwise. He studied Caesar's military campaigns. He read about Roman administrative structures. He saw parallels between his own rise and the rise of history's great conquerors, and he wasn't shy about sharing those parallels with the men who worked for him. This wasn't merely intellectual indulgence. Maranzano genuinely believed that the principles which had allowed Rome to dominate the ancient world could be applied to organizing American crime families. He envisioned a structure with himself at the apex. Caesar, essentially, with subordinate bosses functioning like Roman generals commanding legions, each with defined territories and responsibilities, all ultimately answering to his supreme authority. The confidence in his presence did not mean certainty existed within him. When Joe Masseria was assassinated in April 1931, shot while playing cards at a Coney Island restaurant while his lieutenant Lucky Luciano was conveniently in the bathroom, Maranzano believed his moment had arrived. He called a massive meeting of Italian-American gangsters from across the country, reportedly attended by hundreds of men in a rented hall, and delivered what amounted to a coronation speech. He declared himself Capo di Tutti Capi, boss of all bosses, and announced a new structure he intended to impose on organized crime throughout America. Families would be organized like legions. Each would have a clear chain of command: boss, underboss, capos, soldiers. Disputes between families would be brought to him for adjudication. Territory would be respected, but ultimate authority rested with him alone. It was, in its formal structure, not entirely different from what the Commission would eventually become, but the crucial difference was the absolute, centralized nature of Maranzano's vision. He wasn't creating a board of equals. He was creating an empire with himself as emperor. This distinction mattered enormously to the younger generation of gangsters who fought through the Castellammarese war expecting something different to emerge from the violence. Men like Lucky Luciano, Vito Genovese, and others had risked their lives believing they were ending the era of single autocratic bosses, not simply replacing one autocrat with another who happened to have classical education and a fondness for Roman history. But there was something no one around him could fully understand. Maranzano's obsession with Rome went beyond mere organizational philosophy. Multiple accounts from the period described his office featuring busts of Roman emperors, particularly Julius Caesar. He reportedly kept copies of texts on Roman history and administration prominently displayed. He used Latin phrases in conversation. He saw himself not merely as a successful criminal who happened to enjoy history, but as someone fulfilling a kind of historical destiny, bringing Roman organizational genius into the modern criminal world the way Caesar had once brought it to the ancient Mediterranean. This wasn't simple eccentricity. It revealed something important about how Maranzano understood power and his own relationship to it. He genuinely believed that his historical knowledge gave him insight that his rivals lacked, that understanding the patterns of imperial Rome provided him with a blueprint for permanent dominance. He saw himself as playing a long historical game, building something that would echo through centuries the way Rome's institutions had echoed through the 2,000 years since Caesar's death. But Caesar himself, of course, had been murdered by men he trusted, stabbed by senators who feared his accumulation of absolute power. If Maranzano had studied Roman history as thoroughly as accounts suggest, he should have recognized the warning embedded in his own historical model. Absolute power concentrated in a single figure invites exactly the kind of conspiracy that ended Caesar's life. Instead, Maranzano seemed to focus entirely on the grandeur of Caesar's achievements, while somehow missing the cautionary lesson of his death. He built a world that looked controlled, even while carrying burdens no one could see. The younger gangsters chafed under Maranzano's rule almost immediately. His Roman-inspired hierarchy, with its rigid chains of command and absolute deference to authority, felt suffocating to men who had spent years building cross-ethnic partnerships and flexible business arrangements that didn't fit neatly into legion-style organizational charts. Lucky Luciano in particular found Maranzano's vision fundamentally incompatible with a more pragmatic, profit-focused approach to organized crime that he and his allies, Meyer Lansky, Benjamin Siegel, others, had been developing throughout the 1920s. Maranzano sensed this resistance, and his response revealed the darker side of his Caesar complex. Rather than adapting his structure to accommodate the legitimate concerns of his younger, more capable subordinates, he began to see Luciano specifically as a threat requiring elimination, much as Caesar himself had eliminated rivals who threatened his consolidation of power. He reportedly hired a hitman named Vincent Call, an Irish gangster known for ruthless violence, to assassinate Luciano and several of his closest allies. The plan, as later reconstructed by historians and law enforcement, called for luring Luciano to Maranzano's office under the pretense of a business discussion, where the assassination would actually take place. It was a classic Roman-style elimination of a threatening subordinate, the kind of preemptive strike that emperors throughout history had used against generals who'd grown too popular, too independent, too dangerous to ignore. But Luciano had his own intelligence network. He learned of the plot before it could be executed. What people called legendary often began as something deeply personal. September 10th, 1931. For men dressed as police officers and tax inspectors, the disguise was reportedly Luciano's strategic counter to Maranzano's own plan, designed to gain access to the heavily guarded office through the kind of official credibility that even paranoid bosses rarely challenged. Entered the Grand Central Building, and made their way to Maranzano's ninth-floor office. Account of exactly who participated in the assassination vary, with some sources naming members of what would later be called Murder Incorporated, and others suggesting a more ad hoc group assembled specifically for this purpose. What's certain is what happened once they reached Maranzano's office. The men presented themselves as law enforcement conducting a tax investigation, were able to get past Maranzano's bodyguards and gain direct access to the boss himself. Once inside, the disguise dropped away. Maranzano was stabbed multiple times and then shot, dying in the office that had represented the physical manifestation of his imperial ambitions. The same desk where he planned to eliminate Luciano, now witnessing his own elimination instead. The irony would have been almost too perfect for fiction. a man obsessed with Julius Caesar, murdered by conspirators using deception to gain access, die in his own seat of power exactly as Caesar himself had died in the Roman Senate. Whether the parallel was intentional on Luciano's part, a kind of dark historical commentary on Maranzano's pretensions, or simply coincidental given the practical advantages of the police disguise strategy, remains debated among historians. But the symbolism was impossible to ignore for anyone who knew how thoroughly Maranzano had built his identity around Roman imperial mythology. The image was real, so was the silence afterward. Maranzano's reign as boss of bosses had lasted approximately 5 months. 5 months to build, declare, and lose an empire he believed would echo for generations. The Caesar he'd modeled himself on had ruled for years and built institutions that genuinely did echo through history. Maranzano had built a fragile structure based on personal authority and historical pretension that collapsed the moment its central figure was removed, precisely because he'd never built anything beyond his own personal command. This failure illuminated, by contrast, exactly what Luciano would do differently when he created a commission less than a month after Maranzano's death. Where Maranzano had built an empire dependent entirely on his personal authority, Luciano built a structure designed to survive regardless of any individual's presence. Where Maranzano had positioned himself as Caesar, demanding absolute deference, Luciano positioned himself as merely the most influential member of a governing body of equals. Where Maranzano had drawn his organizational principles from an empire that ultimately required force and conquest to maintain, Luciano drew his principles from negotiation, mutual benefit, and distributed power. The contrast between these two approaches, Maranzano's brittle, personality-dependent empire versus Luciano's resilient, structurally distributed commission, explains why one lasted 5 months while the other lasted, in modified forms, for nearly a century. Many knew the legend of Lucky Luciano's commission. Far fewer remembered the strange, fascinating, ultimately tragic figure whose failure made that commission's success possible. Salvatore Maranzano, the gangster who studied Caesar so thoroughly that he missed the most important lesson Roman history had to offer. That absolute power, however historically justified it might seem to the person wielding it, inevitably generates a kind of resistance that ends in betrayal and violence. That hunger for historical legitimacy came from somewhere much deeper than simple criminal ambition. Maranzano wanted to be remembered as something more than a successful gangster. He wanted his organizational achievements to be understood as continuing a tradition stretching back to antiquity, as proof that the principles which had built the greatest empire in human history could be applied successfully to modern criminal enterprise. In some sense, his vision was more intellectually ambitious than Luciano's pragmatic, business-oriented approach. He was trying to make a historical statement, not just build a profitable organization. But ambition divorced from practical wisdom about human nature and power dynamics proved fatal. Maranzano understood Roman administrative structures intellectually, but he failed to understand, or chose to ignore, the equally important lesson about how absolute power generates the conditions for its own destruction. He built his empire on the model of Caesar's triumph while ignoring the lesson of Caesar's assassination. The real story was never only about the murder in the Grand Central Building Office. It was about the fundamental difference between historical mythology and practical organizational wisdom. Maranzano possessed genuine intellectual sophistication, real historical knowledge, and a clear vision for how he wanted his criminal empire to function. What he lacked was a pragmatic understanding that Luciano possessed in abundance, that lasting power in any context, criminal, political, or historical, requires structures that don't depend entirely on a single person's continued survival and authority. When Lucky Luciano stood before 7 mob bosses in 1931, proposing the commission as an alternative to single boss authority, he was implicitly rejecting everything Maranzano had represented. No more emperors, no more Caesars, no more men who believed their historical knowledge or personal authority entitled them to absolute command. Instead, a structure built on the recognition that distributed power, mutual accountability, and the absence of any single point of failure created something far more durable than any individual's claim to historical greatness. Maranzano had wanted to be remembered as a modern Caesar. Instead, he became a cautionary example. The gangster whose obsession with imperial mythology blinded him to the much simpler reality that men who concentrate absolute power in themselves, however historically justified that concentration might seem, create exactly the conditions that motivate their own elimination. He studied Caesar's rise for years. He spent almost no time studying Caesar's fall. And in the Grand Central Building on September 10, 1931, that selective historical education proved fatal in exactly the way that careful study of the full Roman story might have predicted. The boss of bosses died as Caesar died. Betrayed by men he should have recognized as threats, killed through deception in his own seat of power, his 5-month empire collapsed in the instant its singular foundation was removed. The man who wanted to be Caesar got exactly the ending Caesar's story should have warned him about. He simply never read that part closely enough to apply its lesson to himself.